Something is shifting in the Middle East, and this time, the signals are coming from places that most people are not watching closely enough. The Iran situation, which has been simmering for years beneath layers of diplomacy, proxy conflicts, and quiet negotiations, has now entered a phase that military analysts and geopolitical strategists are describing as genuinely more sensitive than anything we have seen in the past several years. And when they use the word sensitive, they are not talking about diplomatic discomfort. They are talking about the kind of fragile moment where one miscalculation, one misread signal, or one unexpected military move can pull multiple major powers into a confrontation that nobody's fully prepared for. If you have been following global events and wondering why the world feels like it is balancing on a knife's edge right now, this video is going to explain exactly what is happening, why it matters, and what the consequences could be for global security, regional stability, and the broader world economy. Stay with us, because this analysis is going to connect dots that the mainstream coverage is completely missing. And if you find this kind of deep geopolitical breakdown valuable, hit that like button and subscribe to War Alert 24 right now, because we bring you this level of analysis every single time. To understand where things stand today, you have to understand the journey that brought Iran and the broader Middle East to this particular moment. Iran's nuclear program has been at the center of international tension for over 2 decades. The 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, known as the JCPOA, was designed to cap Iran's nuclear capabilities in exchange for sanctions relief. For a brief window, it seemed to work. But when the United States withdrew from that agreement in 2018 and reimposed sweeping sanctions, the deal began to collapse piece by piece. Iran, facing massive economic pressure, made a calculated decision. Rather than returning to the negotiating table on terms it considered unfair, Tehran began advancing its nuclear program in ways that alarmed Western intelligence agencies and Israel simultaneously. Uranium enrichment levels that were once capped climbed steadily. The number of advanced centrifuges installed at key facilities grew, and the stockpile of enriched uranium expanded to levels that had no credible civilian justification in the eyes of non-proliferation experts. But the nuclear dimension is only one layer of what we are watching unfold right now. The broader strategic environment around Iran has changed dramatically. The Abraham Accords transformed the regional landscape by normalizing relations between Israel and several Arab states. The warming of ties between Saudi Arabia and Israel, with American encouragement, created something Iran has long feared: a unified regional bloc that is not just diplomatically aligned against Tehran, but increasingly coordinating on security matters. At the same time, Iran has been deepening its ties with Russia and China, positioning itself within a broader axis of states that are collectively pushing back against American-led international order. When you see Iran through that lens, its behavior starts to make a different kind of sense. Tehran is not acting irrationally. It is making calculated moves within a global strategic competition that extends far beyond the borders of the Middle East. What has made the current phase genuinely more sensitive is a convergence of several developments happening simultaneously. First, there have been renewed and serious back-channel diplomatic conversations between American and Iranian officials, reportedly facilitated through intermediaries. These conversations have been more substantive than anything in recent years, but they are also more fragile because the domestic political constraints on both sides are severe. In Iran, the hardline political establishment views any compromise as a surrender to American pressure, particularly after the U.S. withdrew from the JCPOA. In the United States, any deal with Iran faces fierce domestic opposition from political factions that view Tehran as an irredeemable adversary. This means that even when both sides are technically talking, the space for agreement is narrow and easily destroyed by a single provocative incident. Second, the situation in Gaza and the broader regional conflict has created enormous additional pressure on Iran's strategic calculus. Iran has long supported Hamas, Hezbollah, and other armed groups across the region as part of what it calls an axis of resistance. The war in Gaza put that support relationship under an international spotlight. Iran had to publicly navigate a very difficult position, appearing supportive of Palestinian resistance while also avoiding direct military confrontation with Israel and the United States, which could have immediately escalated into a full-scale regional war. The direct exchange of strikes between Iran and Israel in 2024, which saw Iran launch a massive drone and missile attack, and Israel respond with targeted strikes, was a watershed moment. For the first time in the modern era, Iran and Israel engaged in direct military exchanges on each other's territory, rather than purely through proxy forces. That crossed a threshold. And while both sides chose to limit the escalation at that point, the psychological and strategic barrier has now been broken. Third, the internal situation inside Iran itself is more complex and more volatile than it has been in years. The death of President Ebrahim Raisi in a helicopter crash in 2024 triggered a significant leadership transition. His successor emerged from the same hardline political current, but the transition itself created a moment of internal uncertainty. The economy inside Iran remains deeply stressed under sanctions, with significant portions of the population struggling with high inflation, currency depreciation, and unemployment. The Iranian government faces a persistent challenge: maintaining political legitimacy at home while pursuing an aggressive external posture that brings further economic pain through continued international isolation. Now, let's talk about something that does not get enough attention in standard geopolitical coverage, and that is the economic architecture underlying this entire situation. The Iran crisis is not just a military and diplomatic story. It is fundamentally an economic story with global consequences. Iran sits on some of the world's largest reserves of oil and natural gas. Under sanctions, its ability to export those resources has been severely restricted, but Tehran has found ways to circumvent those restrictions, particularly through arrangements with China, which has been quietly absorbing Iranian oil at discounted prices. This matters for global energy markets in ways that are not immediately obvious. When Iranian oil flows to China under the radar, it affects global supply dynamics. But when a genuine military escalation threatens to disrupt Iranian oil production or close the Strait of Hormuz, the effect on global energy markets would be immediate, dramatic, and felt in every country that imports oil. The Strait of Hormuz is arguably the single most strategically important waterway in the world for energy markets. Approximately 20% of the world's oil supply and a significant portion of global liquefied natural gas passes through this narrow strait every single day. Iran has repeatedly signaled its capability and willingness to disrupt or close the strait in a scenario of open conflict. A serious disruption of the strait, even a temporary one, would send energy prices surging globally. That kind of price shock would ripple through transportation costs, manufacturing costs, food production costs, and ultimately household expenses for hundreds of millions of people far from the Middle East. Countries in Europe, which have already experienced enormous energy stress in the wake of the Ukraine conflict, would be particularly vulnerable to this kind of secondary shock. Beyond energy, the broader economic implications of an escalating Iran crisis include the impact on global trade routes through the Red Sea and the Gulf region. The attacks on commercial shipping in the Red Sea by Houthi forces, which Iran has supported and armed, already forced a significant rerouting of global shipping traffic through the longer Cape of Good Hope route around Africa. This added weeks to shipping times and significant costs to global supply chains. A deeper escalation involving Iran would intensify these disruptions and push insurance premiums for shipping in the entire region to levels that would make certain routes economically unviable for extended periods. When shipping becomes more expensive and slower, everything that moves by ship becomes more expensive and slower. That includes a vast portion of globally traded goods. The defense spending dimension is also important and often underreported. As the Iran situation has intensified, multiple countries in the region have been dramatically increasing their military expenditures. Saudi Arabia, Israel, the United Arab Emirates, and others have been acquiring advanced weapon systems, expanding their air defense capabilities, and investing in technologies designed to counter Iranian missile and drone threats. This surge in defense spending is reshaping the allocation of government budgets across the region, drawing resources away from development and social spending. It is also creating enormous business opportunities for defense contractors and arms suppliers, primarily from the United States, but also increasingly from Europe. This is one of the quiet economic realities of escalating regional tension. It is enormously profitable for a narrow set of industries, while being broadly costly for economies and populations. There's also a dimension of cyber warfare and technological competition embedded in the Iran story that has direct economic relevance. Iran has developed one of the most capable cyber warfare programs of any nation that is not a traditional great power. Iranian cyber operations have targeted energy infrastructure, financial systems, and communications networks in the United States, Israel, Saudi Arabia, and beyond. The Stuxnet attack on Iran's nuclear facilities years ago launched a cyber arms race in the region, and Iran has been a serious participant in that race. Cyber attacks on critical infrastructure have the potential to cause economic disruption at a scale that conventional military operations often cannot achieve. When you think about the economic consequences of escalation with Iran, you have to include the risk of significant cyber operations against financial and energy infrastructure, not just physical military strikes. One of the most analytically interesting aspects of the current phase is the role that China and Russia are playing in Iran's strategic calculus. China's relationship with Iran has deepened significantly, driven primarily by Beijing's appetite for discounted energy and its broader strategic interest in supporting states that are pushing back against American global primacy. The 25-year cooperation agreement signed between China and Iran represents a long-term commitment that gives Tehran a degree of economic and strategic cover that it did not have before. Russia's relationship with Iran has also deepened dramatically in the context of the Ukraine conflict, with Iran supplying drones to Russia that had been used extensively in that war. This triangular relationship between Moscow, Tehran, and Beijing is one of the defining features of the current geopolitical landscape, and it significantly constrains the leverage that the United States and its allies can apply to Iran. But here is the analytical point that is most important for understanding why this moment is genuinely more sensitive than previous cycles of tension. All of the major actors in this situation are facing significant domestic constraints that limit their flexibility. The United States is navigating its own complex political environment, in which any perceived weakness toward Iran or any miscalculation that leads to American casualties would carry severe political consequences. Israel faces its own internal divisions about strategy, with significant debate about whether to prioritize the Gaza situation, manage the Hezbollah threat in Lebanon, or focus on the long-term Iranian nuclear threat. Iran's leadership is managing an economy under severe stress while trying to project strength externally to maintain domestic legitimacy. And the regional Arab states are trying to balance their security partnerships with the United States against their economic relationships with China and their complex calculations about Iran's regional role. When every major player in a geopolitical crisis is operating with limited flexibility, the risk of miscalculation increases dramatically. In strategic terms, this is sometimes described as a situation with tight coupling. Events move quickly, options are constrained, and the window for de-escalation can close very rapidly once a crisis begins. Analysts who have been tracking the Iran situation carefully are noting that the combination of nuclear advancement, regional military tensions, strained diplomacy, and domestic political constraints across multiple capitals has created exactly this kind of tightly coupled environment. That is what makes the current phase so sensitive and why it demands careful attention. Looking ahead, there are several possible trajectories. A successful diplomatic outcome is still theoretically possible, but it requires political will and domestic political space that currently appears very limited on multiple sides. A continued state of managed tension with periodic flare-ups but no full-scale conflict is arguably the most likely near-term scenario, but it is also inherently unstable and could shift very quickly. An escalation to a more serious military confrontation, while not the base case for most analysts, cannot be excluded, and the consequences of such a scenario would be felt globally in ways that extend far beyond the Middle East. Military conflict involving Iran's nuclear facilities would carry enormous risks of a broader regional war, significant civilian casualties, and the kind of global economic disruption that would affect markets, energy supplies, trade routes, and economic stability across the entire world. What the international community needs right now is serious, patient, and realistic diplomacy that acknowledges the legitimate security concerns of all parties while establishing verifiable limits on the most dangerous aspects of Iran's nuclear program. That is easier to describe than to achieve, because the political environment in which such diplomacy must operate is genuinely difficult. But the alternative, a region sliding toward conflict driven by miscalculation and constrained options, is a scenario with consequences that no responsible analyst would wish to see unfold. This is exactly the kind of situation where informed public understanding matters, because the decisions that governments make in these moments are ultimately influenced by what their populations know and care about. And that is why conversations like the one we are having right now, where we break down the complexity, connect the dots, and explain both the military and economic dimensions of what is unfolding, are so important. We want to hear what you think about all of this. Do you believe diplomacy still has a real chance in this situation? Do you think the economic pressures on Iran will eventually shift Tehran's calculations? Or do you see the situation moving toward a more dangerous confrontation? Drop your analysis in the comments below, because the community on this channel brings genuinely thoughtful perspectives, and we read every single comment. Share this video with someone who wants to understand what is really happening in the Middle East right now, not just the headlines, but the full strategic picture. And if you are not already subscribed to War Alert 24, now is the time. We cover global conflicts, military strategy, and geopolitical analysis with the depth and seriousness that this moment in history demands. Thank you for watching, stay informed, and we will see you in the next one.